Hello and welcome to the RotoWire WNBA show, where we talk about fantasy basketball. I'm Jason Shebilske alongside Kirien Sprecher. Today we'll recap the action from around the WNBA this weekend, and with a few days off on the schedule to begin the week, we'll also give you some players worth targeting in trades. And finally, we'll preview tomorrow's Commissioner's Cup championship between the Lynx and the Liberty. Those looking to test RotoWire's full slate of tools can visit rotowire.com/try for a free trial. And if you have any questions during the show, you can ask them in the comments and we'll get them answered. If they're asked live, we'll talk about them on the show, but you can also ask them afterward and we'll get them answered in the comments. Kieran, there was no shortage of entertaining matchups over the weekend, including yesterday's thrilling matchup between the Fever and the Sky. What's one thing that you learned from this weekend's action?
There was no shortage of of streaming options for this entertaining weekend, right? I think this was like one of those middle of the season weeks where a lot of teams like the Liberty were kind of like cautious with resting players who have injuries or absences, and they're like, there's no reason to rush back right now. Like, take your time. It's the middle of the season. It's the dog days of the season. Like, we have players that need to get playing time anyways, and give those players a chance while you rest up and prepare for the stretch run. So, you look at like the Sparks, Cameron Brink went down, and you have Stephanie Talbot and Lee Ueru. I think I said that one right this time.
Mm-hmm.
Talbot has had 3 straight games with at least 19 ESPN fantasy points, including 32 on Saturday. Ueru has double-digit fantasy points in 8 of the last 9. You can also look at Zia Cook and Ray Burrell, who each had 39 ESPN fantasy points over the 2 games this weekend. Los Angeles Sparks backcourt remains in flux. Like we've talked about, Lexi Brown, Laisha Clarendon, Ari McDonald, that just keeps going down the list. And now it's Cook and Burrell's time to like have some streaming value. So that's 4 players from the Sparks that put together like strong fantasy performances over the weekend. And you can just keep going down the list. I already mentioned the Liberty. You got Kayla Thornton and Leonie Phoebish, who are both fantastic. Go to the wings. They got Natasha Howard back, but JC Sheldon and Sevgi Uzgan continue to put up big numbers. Atlanta got Jordin Canada back, but Haley Jones was a fantastic streamer. And then Jordan Horston, I feel like we were kind of surprised that Victoria Vivians got the start to begin the season as the 5th starter in Seattle. But Horston has 91 ESPN fantasy points over her last 3, and she finally moved in the starting lineup last game. She's basically available in every league. So there's just plenty of streaming options available that there were this weekend. And I know there's a limited schedule this week because of the Commissioner's Cup, but these players are going to continue to produce for their respective teams.
Yeah, and especially with the Talbot Ueru conundrum, I think that we both agreed that Lee Ueru was the player that we wanted to target when Cameron Brink went down, because Ueru was performing really well before Brink got hurt. And then I also talked with Liz on Friday's show about the two of them because they had one game without Brink, and Stephanie Talbot performed really well. But then Stephanie Talbot had another really stellar game, and Ueru was also pretty strong, but like Talbot just kind of shined off the bench. So it'll be interesting, especially with the plus minus. I think Ueru's was like negative 20 something, and Stephanie Talbot's was like in the plus teens somewhere. So if Stephanie Talbot can keep it up, it wouldn't surprise me if potentially they try out Talbot in the starting 5 and move Ueru to the bench while still like seeing increased playing time. I think that both of them will have the chance to have fantasy relevant roles, but it's just a matter of which player's upside you want to target more. And I think it's trending toward both of them being about on the same playing field right now, which is really interesting compared to where we were a week ago.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think the difference between Ueru and Talbot and the other players I mentioned is Brink's absence is just it creates more opportunities for both of them moving forward. While you look at, like I mentioned, Thornton and Phoebish, like when Courtney Vandersloot comes back, when Lainey Hamilton comes back, like that'll probably limit one of them or two of both of them. And then in Dallas, maybe not so much. Arike Agumbwale continues to deal with that Achilles soreness. She's been playing the last couple games, but not really like to the level we expect. So maybe that's still bothering her a little bit. So like maybe, when she gets back to 100%, Sheldon and Uzan's production drop again. And then, like I said, with Horston, like she got moved into the starting lineup. I hope that sticks. I think that should have been the move from the beginning of the season, but Seattle's still been playing pretty well. So everyone and Haley Jones, obviously Jordin Canada came off the bench, got 3 fouls really fast. Like Canada's going to probably start before long, and Jones will probably move back to the bench. So I think of all of the names that we mentioned, like that Talbot Ueru is probably the main focus for people that have a streaming spot available.
Yeah, and I think the wings too could at least continue for the next couple of weeks because they'll still be without Maddie Siegrist. So maybe JC Sheldon and Sevgi Uzun continue to have those roles, but they're maybe a little bit more inconsistent than what you would expect out of players like Talbot and Ueru. And yeah, Jordan Horston, I picked her up in a few of my leagues about 3 games ago, and it feels like she's almost undroppable now. I think she's gone over 30 ESPN fantasy points in her last 2 games. So that's about as consistent as you can ask for out of any player. So I've been very pleased with her.
Yeah, Horston 6 straight in double figures and 91 over her last 3. So she's averaging 30 since you picked her up. And like that's like round 3, round 4 level production, and you're getting that off the waiver wire. I'll just run through the stats for Thornton and Phoebish. The Liberty had back-to-back this weekend. Thornton had 52 fantasy points and Phoebish had 40 during that stretch. So not quite to the level of Horston, but that's still like 20 plus 25 fantasy points per game over the weekend. Phoebish has scored double-digit fantasy points in 8 straight, and she's scored 20 plus 4 times during that stretch. So like this isn't like, oh, pick them up and hopefully you get like 12, 10, 12 points. Like this is like they're fantasy players. These players need to be rostered, and they're just not.
Yeah, and like you mentioned with Courtney Vandersloot and Benijah Laney Hamilton, I think that they'll be back at some point, but both players, both Thornton and Phoebish, have shown enough that I think that they'll still be pretty solid contributors off the bench. So I think that there are a lot of intriguing names that you brought up, and there's really no shortage of streaming options, especially if you're in a league with like 8 or fewer teams. I know that we're in a 10-team league together, and sometimes the waiver wire can get pretty bare, especially if the rest of the league is pretty active. But there are a lot of players who are under rostered who probably should be rostered in more leagues at this point.
Yeah, and you guys were talking, you and Liz were talking on Friday. I was tuning into that one, and she mentioned Haley Jones like for a second, and I was really high on Haley Jones. I think we had a viewer question at the beginning of the season after Haley like got the starting assignment when Canada was ruled out, and I was like, hey, look what she did last year when she had extended minutes. Like this is a star player, like maybe not a star player, but this is like a consistent starter that can put up numbers. And it just wasn't there like at all to begin the season. It was really, really bad. She was still a starter, so I felt like I still kept her on some of my fantasy teams. I let go of her a couple weeks ago, but I picked her back up this week as a streaming option. Double-digit fantasy points in 5 straight, including 3 over 20. And that includes Canada coming back in the last game. So like, I don't know. I think Canada once she gets back to 100%, she gets back in the starting lineup, she starts playing 30 minutes, she stays out of foul trouble, like Jones's role will decrease. But I mean, 3 straight games of 20 ESPN fantasy points is a really good stretch for a player like Jones.
Yeah, and in Sunday's game, even with Canada back, even with the Dream trailing big, they wound up losing by 21 points. Haley Jones played 39 minutes, which obviously probably unsustainable. Jordin Canada's minutes will increase, but Ryan Howard's absence leaves some big shoes to fill. So it's going to take, I think, more than one player to do that. And getting Jordin Canada back certainly helps. But even if Haley Jones potentially moves to the bench at some point, I think that she'll still have enough minutes. But especially with Ryan Howard out, it wouldn't surprise me if she's able to retain that starting role, even if Canada moves back to the starting 5 at some point.
Yeah, and we don't really know. We haven't heard any confirmation on a Howard return timetable, but she was spotted in a boot, and they said like there isn't a timetable. So I would assume like probably after the Olympic break. So that still gives a couple weeks for Haley Jones to have a path to a starting role.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the aforementioned matchup between Indiana and Chicago that seemed to have basically all eyes on it this weekend, the rookies showed out as Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, and Camila Cardoso all put up double-doubles. with Clark setting a Fever franchise record with 13 assists and Reese extending the WNBA rookie record with 8 consecutive double-doubles. Are you at all surprised that these players are performing so well this early in their professional careers?
I would say some aspects of what they're doing has surprised me, and some of what they're doing hasn't really been surprising, right? I think, you look at Clark, and she's always been a fantastic passer, right? And she has better teammates, Aaliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell. These are bucket getters, like they can score. So you're not really surprised by Clark's like assist numbers, but what I'm surprised with Clark is her like willingness to pass. She's attempted 17 shots twice. That's her season high. And she hasn't attempted more than 12 in her last 6. Fever 4-2 during that stretch. So she's really like operating as a floor general. She's not chucking a bunch of shots. For comparison, you look at Arike Ogunbowale, who I like to compare Clark early in her career to Ogunbowale because I think like lead point guard that shoots a lot of threes can score from a lot of places. Like I think that's a pretty fair comparison. Ogunbowale is averaging 22.1 shots per game. So like that's a substantial amount more than Clark is. So I think Clark's willingness to get her teammates involved and not like play that hero ball that she kind of did in college has been surprising to me. I thought Clark was going to be shooting 20 plus times per game and kind of like having that Ogunbowale role where her efficiency wasn't so great, but she put up numbers and she dished out assists. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in Sunday's game, the Fever had some pretty easy shots that they wound up missing off of some beautiful Clark passes. I remember in particular in the first half, there was a 3/4 court bounce pass that Caitlin Clark makes to, I think, Kelsey Mitchell, who then like had an easy layup and just wound up missing, which is kind of uncharacteristic for Kelsey Mitchell. But even with the franchise record, it feels like there's still some room where that assist number can grow. And down the stretch, the Fever seem to kind of keep the ball out of Caitlin Clark's hands. But you've got to think that if some players can't make shots, that they'll try to get the ball into Clark's hands more. So that'll just increase their scoring opportunities even more. So I think that there's a level that we haven't yet seen out of her at the professional level, which is pretty scary to think about given what she's shown so far.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And another, Kelsey Mitchell is fantastic, but another instance in the second half, I think it was the fourth quarter, Mitchell had a back cut and Clark found her a perfect back cut. Mitchell blows the wide open layup, and then the next possession she comes down and she crosses someone over, Euro steps and make a crazy layup. I'm like, oh, you make that one. And I was watching with my my father-in-law, and he's just like, oh, Mitchell must not like Clark. She doesn't want to make the layup to get Clark's more assists. I was like, shut up, man. You're just old. But yeah, I mean, you look at LeBron in the NBA, right? And early in his career, he always got discredited for passing late in the game. Even later in his career, passing late in the game. But that's the right move. Clark was double teamed. That bounce pass to Aaliyah Boston, I feel like at the end of that game, I felt like that was the right move. And if Clark continues to make the right basketball move, day in, day out, game in, game out, she's going to be one of the best players that ever played in this league. So moving on from Clark, I think to Angel Reese, the surprising thing for her, in my opinion, has been her ability to score, right? I always thought she was going to be a good rebounder, a good defender, but she's been able to put the ball in the basket. Career high, 25 points last night, was by far the best player on the court. And now she's shooting 40% from the field, right? So while she has been able to score 40% for a big, Arike Ogunbowale, Caitlin Clark, you're shooting a lot of threes, you're shooting a lot of deep threes, 40%, you can live with that. For a big, that's got to improve. But Reese has been just amazing at the free throw line, which kind of makes you think that maybe a jumper could turn in, pop up eventually later in her career. She went 2 for 8 during her WNBA debut, and since then she's shooting 82% from the line. That's fantastic. I wish I could shoot 82% from the free throw line. That's a really strong mark. Luka Doncic in the NBA shoots 68%. So, and he's considered a great shooter. So 82% from the free throw line for Reese is fantastic. She went 9 for 11 last night on Sunday. If she continues to do that with her active, presence on the glass, she's going to be a double-double machine for a decade plus.
Yeah, and one thing with rookies that I think has gone overlooked, especially this season, I think people expected Clark to come right onto the scene and just put up those flashy college stat lines that we saw. But with the level of talent around players in the WNBA, I think that, for example, with the Fever, there have been some times when Aaliyah Boston has had her chances to shine, Kelsey Mitchell and Nelissa Smith, which is all understandable because they're all incredible players. With the Sky, there have been a few moments where Marina Mabrey has struggled, especially late in games, but the Sky have seemed to be able to rely on Angel Reese to really step up into that leadership role, which just about 15, I think 14 games now into her professional career is really incredible to think about just how much room she still can grow and how much she's already grown in such a short period.
Yeah, she seems like the leader of that team. Like anytime I tune into a Sky game, she's the one barking orders on defense. She's the one trying to get everyone in a huddle. And you're 100% right. That is phenomenal stuff for a rookie.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess I can just touch on Cardoso a little bit. The last rookie that played in that game, or the last of like the big three rookies. I haven't really been surprised by anything she's done. She was injured to start the season. Took some time to get going. She's finally showing her stuff recently. She's averaging 12 points, 8 boards, and a block since moving into the starting lineup. I'm looking forward to more of that. I thought she like excelled as a passer in college, so I kind of am waiting to see like that big to big passing between Reese and Cardoso. So that would be kind of exciting, but nothing really like surprising with Camila so far. Just looking forward to her playing more because she hasn't really gotten a huge opportunity yet.
Yeah, even though her minutes restriction is gone, I think that it's still just a matter of building chemistry, which will come down the stretch. It really seemed to blossom during last night's game, and I think that there will be more opportunities to showcase that down the stretch. So if you enjoy content like this, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. So moving on to some players to trade for, Natasha Howard surprisingly returned to action last Thursday against the Sky, and she's now appeared in the Wings' last 3 games. She's had a minutes limit, but has also seen her playing time steadily increase, most recently playing 30 minutes in Sunday's loss to Washington. While she's had decent production, do you think that she's worth trading for, or has the time to buy low passed?
That's a good question. I mean, you can obviously try to trade for her and see, like, what whoever has her rostered, what kind of return they're looking for. Um, I think, I think Natasha Howard is the 1B, 1A in Dallas. So if you can get her for, a couple, like a tier 2 and a tier 3 player, and you can get a solid starting, like a solid star in your lineup, like I think that's worth it. I think Howard's, playing time restriction, like whatever, that's out the window. Like I think she's going to be playing her usual role, which has been, a top tier fantasy player the last couple seasons.
Yeah, and even though the Wings have lost 11 consecutive games, they're just 3.5 games out of the playoff picture. So they still could make a run toward the playoffs at some point. And if they do so, it seems like Natasha Howard will have to be an integral part. So if you have a manager who maybe sees her 27 fantasy points from her return and corroborates that with, oh, maybe she isn't as productive, potentially you could uh, have some like make a savvy move and get her production for down the stretch.
Yeah, and I think one thing, you said they lost 11 straight. They might fall down the standings. Agumbawale is dealing with that Achilles soreness. Maybe they need Howard if Agumbawale is going to be a little banged up. But then you also look at, like, they don't really have a bunch of young back or front court options, right? So you want that veteran presence in Howard to help out Uzan and Sheldon, who you're going to prioritize in their development if you fall further down the standings. So it's interesting. For right now, like I wouldn't envision Howard, being relegated to a smaller role to give other people opportunities in the final weeks of the season. Like I just don't envision that right now. So I have no worries about trading for her and having her produce during the fantasy playoffs.
Right. I totally agree.
My first player that I'm going to trade for, I'm a pretty a boring trade guy. It all depends on the communication that you have with other players in your league, right? So like a league that I'm in with Jason and other coworkers, like I talk to them often, so it's easier to like, work out a trade and gauge the value of what the other players think of. And then I'm in another league where it's a bunch of random people that joined the league to try and beat me. So like, I don't know if they are going to be very willing to trade with me. I don't communicate with them on a regular basis. I don't know how they value players. So it all depends on your league settings and how familiar you are with them. But I'm just going to stick with, let's trade for the best of the best. And then that'll open up more opportunities for all those streaming options. Like I said, we went through, 8-10 players that put up solid production that you could have picked off the waiver wire. So my first player that I'm going to say to trade for is Breanna Stewart. Finally exploded over this weekend. 6 blocks, 7 blocks. I don't remember exactly what it was, but she put up just like 70 ESPN fantasy points. Whoever's rostering her may have, taken a hit because she wasn't putting up like the, superstar production that she's used to. So trading a couple of tier 2 players for a superstar like Stewie can open up that streaming spot on your roster. And having the best player in the league, the reigning MVP, like that's never a bad idea.
Yeah, and this year especially, maybe you have a fantasy manager who has seen those inconsistent performances early in the season. I say inconsistent, but it's really inconsistent for Stewie's purposes. Yeah. But now she's really hitting her stride. So it feels like if you can get her for the stretch run, that she would be a really productive option for you. So we have a viewer question from Nacho's Gone. Do we think that Mo Billings will be able to stay a true fantasy option? So this is in light of Natasha Howard returning. That is a really good question. And I think that the Maddie Siegrist return buys Mo Billings some time. She's come off the bench in her last 2 appearances with Natasha Howard returning to action, which certainly doesn't help her fantasy status, but she still put up 24 ESPN fantasy points. Because of all the production that she showed earlier this year, I think that I am holding on to Mo Billings for now, but I would re-examine probably after a week, and I'm assuming that that's something that we will talk about on the show down the stretch, just to see how she develops, because a 10 and a 24 point like fantasy point performance is kind of hard to gauge like what's going to be the norm. So if we get a few more games under the sample and see how that shapes out, I think we can see a little bit more what we expect for the rest of the season.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Nacho's gone. I think, you look at Billings moving to the bench and it kind of raises some red flags. She played 30 minutes off the bench in the last game. And since moving to the bench, Tierra McCowan has played 14 minutes and 10 minutes as a starter. So, the bench, whoever's starting, whoever's not starting, it just seems like it's going to be whoever has the juice on any given night. And Mo Billings right now is playing for a contract, right? Like she signed a hardship contract at the beginning of the season. So like, that she has a more incentive, to play harder and to be productive. And we talked about Dallas not really playing well. You need a player like Billings who's going to go out there and, give it her all. And she had a season high 14 rebounds off the bench. So I think even if she's moves to the bench, but she's still getting consistent playing time, I'm holding for now, just given her production early in the season.
Yeah, and I think with Billings, I wouldn't consider her necessarily in that undroppable category that I maybe would have a few weeks ago anymore. But I think that she's still worth holding on to see if that works out. So my next player to trade for is Brittney Griner. She's another player who returned from a lengthy absence somewhat recently, as she made her season debut June 7th. Her results have fluctuated slightly since returning, but she's now had 3 consecutive appearances with at least 40 fantasy points between June 9th and June 16th. She's cooled off slightly in the games since then, most recently posting 19 fantasy points during Saturday's loss to the Lynx. It seems like this could be an opportunity to trade for her, as we've seen her dominance on full display, but her small sample makes her seem a bit more inconsistent than she actually is. Is she also someone you think is worth trading for, or are you holding off?
Yeah, no, I'm all in on the Brittney Griner trade. Just given all of the things that she's had to deal with the last couple seasons, the Mercury not being good, whatever happened in Russia, all of that stuff. Like, I think her mindset is like, I just want to play hoops. And when she's playing hoops, she's one of the best players in the league. The Mercury currently 8-8, 6th place overall. They're probably not going to fall out of the playoff picture anytime soon, but I expect them to make a little bit of a run, and I expect Griner to be a big part of that. So I'm all in on Brittney Griner. I don't really have like a clear package that I would want to give up to get her, but there's not many players in the league that I would rather have right now than Brittney Griner.
Yeah, and with her, it seems like she's a player who can have that solid top tier production, but maybe you're able to get a 1-for-1 or like a pretty solid player, and then like more of a streaming option. So I don't know. I think it's worth at least kicking the tires if there's another fantasy manager with her.
Yeah, and I think you could bring up, just to play devil's advocate, you could bring up like, oh, Clea Copper's there, oh, Tarasi's there, like blah blah. But it's like, Brittney Griner is just going to be setting screens for those ladies and then rolling to the basket and then, getting easier buckets. And, then she can focus on defense and get those multiple blocks, which, really skyrocket those fantasy points. So, I'm not too worried about Copper and Tarasi like taking fantasy production away from Griner. Like, they just play different positions.
Right.
So, this probably isn't going to be a surprise after my first pick, but A'ja Wilson's going to be my next one. This is likely going to be a harder one to swing just because she's been more productive than Breanna Stewart has been so far. But, I mean, if I have like Caitlin Clark and Kayla McBride and I can package those two for Wilson, like a 2-for-1, that opens up a streaming spot. We talked a couple weeks ago about the Fever already having played a lot of games, so that kind of reduces the Fever's players' fantasy value or potential, probably is the right word, moving forward. So if I compare like 2 tier 2 players to get a player like Wilson, and then I can have like 3 top 12 players, that really gives you a boost. And then like I said, like all of the streaming options available, you can easily fill that roster spot and stream in someone scoring 20-25 fantasy points at this point in the season.
Yeah, this move, I think it really depends for me on what kind of league you're in. If it's a 10-team league where the waiver wire might be kind of depleted, I think that it's tough to justify a move for Wilson because there might not be the streaming talent that you can get. But if you're in a 6 to 8-team league and you have not another manager who is willing to make that 2-for-1 move, I think that's definitely worthwhile because Wilson's production has been that of 2 players so far. We also saw the return of Jordin Canada recently, who had a pretty substantial minutes limit while playing off the bench Sunday, as she tallied 6 points, 4 rebounds, and 2 assists in 14 minutes. She's rostered in 70% of leagues following her lengthy absence, which is relatively unsurprising since the Dream handled her absence on a game-by-game basis. It felt like you weren't really able to drop her because you didn't know when she would be able to return. Her return comes at a crucial time for Atlanta, as Ryan Howard was just ruled out indefinitely. Canada is slightly riskier than other players with extended absences, as she isn't only dealing with conditioning issues, but she's also working on developing a rapport with a team that has already played nearly half of a season together. If you roster Canada, are you looking to trade her or are you holding her for now?
I think you got to hold her after that lackluster debut, right? Like only 14 minutes. That's only going to go up. If you're trading, you're probably trading for what she did on Sunday, and not trading for what she could potentially do. So I'm just trying to hold her for now, and waiting for her value to increase. Like you said, Howard's gone. Canada had a lot of steam during the preseason action. Like they named her the starting point guard. It seemed like it was going to be like her show to run with Gray and Howard and like playing I don't want to say secondary roles, but more of like scoring roles. And Canada was just going to be the point guard. And you look in Atlanta and you're like, this is a lot of good teams. If you have Canada running the point, she could put up really big numbers. I think that's still true. I think that can still happen. The Dream are falling, might be without Howard for a long time, but I'm holding Canada. I'm waiting for that value to increase. And because I don't think anyone is going to be willing to give up anything of substance. Like I don't want to give up any Does that make sense?
Yeah, it feels like her value is at a low point, and if you do want to move her at some point, I think you have to wait for a few more solid performances before you can do so.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely be looking to trade for her if someone was like, "Hey, I waited all this time, and now Canada dropped 6 points in her debut. Like, I need to move on." Like, yeah, I'll take her. Like, let me give you one of my streaming. Let me give you Sevgi Uzin. I've been
Yeah,
using her as a streamer. Like, I would do that trade in a heartbeat. But I mean,
yeah,
probably
absolutely.
not realistic.
Right.
So then my last one is classic. I already did the first two. Asia Wilson, Breanna Stewart. So the consensus third pick was Alyssa Thomas this year. She's seen a slight drop in her scoring from a year ago, but I expect her production to uptick as the postseason gets closer. Another player that I'm willing to go 2-for-1 with, so I can open up a streaming spot.
Yeah, and especially after she dropped a season low 16 ESPN fantasy points on Friday, it seems like now would probably be a good time to jump in and see if the fantasy manager with her is looking to trade. She hasn't had quite as many flashy performances this year. Like last year, she was a triple double machine. Now Brianna Jones is back in action, so it's understandable that Thomas's role has decreased slightly. But Thomas has still been a really reliable option, and I think that'll only continue down the stretch, especially with how solid the Sun have been. I think that they will be competing for the best record in the WNBA, and if they want to keep up, then I think that they'll need Alyssa Thomas to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I would go to whoever owns or whoever has Alyssa Thomas rostered, sorry, and be like, hey, look, Jordan Horston scored 91 ESPN fantasy points over the last 3 games. Alyssa Thomas only scored 16 last game. Clearly, she needs to be traded, obviously.
Right. Before we move on to our next section, we have a comment from Rafael Castillo. He was able to get Stephanie Talbot and Ari McDonald off of waivers before they popped off and hoping to continue his undefeated season. Yeah, with those two players, you're definitely in a good spot to continue that undefeated season, and be sure to keep watching for more players to add as the season progresses to stay in the mix for players down the stretch.
Yeah,
Uh,
good luck, Raphael. Hopefully you don't have to count on too many sparks for a long term period, but it sounds like you're having a good season, and I'm sure that'll continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So finally, to close out today's show, you may notice that there are off days on the schedule for tonight and Wednesday. That's because we have the Commissioner's Cup Championship happening tomorrow night between the Lynx and Liberty. This is a matchup between two teams that have hit their stride recently, and I think that's a perk of the new tournament format. New York is opening as a 5.5 point favorite at home. They're kind of playing at home since they won't be playing at the Barclays Center due to the NBA draft. Both teams are 9-1 over their last 10 games. So, do you think this line should be a bit more even, or do you think that the Liberty are properly favored?
So before I get into it, we're positive, or I mean, at least in my leagues that I looked this morning, the Commissioner's Cup Championship isn't counting towards fantasy in ESPN leagues.
That's correct. As
Okay.
of now, I don't believe, and I think that was also the case last year, but
Yeah.
the game was a little bit different. I think it would just add a game, but because it doesn't count toward regular season
Yeah,
standings,
because
I don't
it's
think
it's
that it
just one
counts.
extra game for these two teams, so it doesn't really. I have I said I had Phoebish and Thornton, so I was hoping that I could continue streaming them for one extra game, but alas,
Yeah,
it's still going to be an exciting matchup. Even if you don't have any fantasy implications, like you said, two of the hottest teams. I don't think this line is off. I think it's pretty fair that the Liberty are favored. I think they've deserved the right to be, I wouldn't heavy favorites. A 5-point favorite isn't really heavy, but like that, if it was more of a toss up, it would probably be like a 2.5, 3-point spread. So I think this is a pretty heavy favorite given, they're the top two teams in the league, or the two hottest teams in the league right now. I just think that the Liberty's bench has been too strong. I mentioned Thornton, Phoebish, Marquise Davis. Like there's other players that are performing that even with Laney Hamilton, and Vandersloot being out, the Liberty haven't missed a stride. I do love Minnesota's starting lineup. I just don't think they're as deep as New York, and I think that depth is where the Liberty get that added bonus. I have Naficia Collier as an MVP future. That it isn't looking too great at this moment. Because and right now I would probably have to say that Breanna Stewart and Sabrina Ionescu are the two like hottest players coming into this game. Ionescu has been fantastic. Stewie had that huge game. Kayla McBride is probably the X factor for Minnesota. She's cooled off considerably since her scorching hot start. If she shoots like she did earlier in the season when she was shooting like 60% from three, like this game's going to be a lot closer. If she doesn't, New York should cruise.
Yeah, for me, I think it'll be intriguing to see whether Betnijah Laney Hamilton and Courtney Vandersloot can return, and if they can, how much they'll be limited. You mentioned that New York has been able to use a lot of depth this year, but I think that the absences for both players sounded precautionary in order to prepare them for Tuesday's game, but they could still have some rust. And even though they are productive players at their full potential, I think that any rust that they show takes away from potentially having minutes from Kayla Thornton or Leonie Phoebish, who have both been really solid and are kind of hitting their stride. So I think it's just a matter of how much production they're able to get, especially if they do bring Laney Hamilton and Vandersloot back to the court.
Yeah, Vandersloot lost her mom and was gone grieving, but the last two games that she was ruled out for, she was ruled out with a return to conditioning competition tag. So that kind of suggests that she's been, practicing, doing 5-on-5 stuff. Obviously, there's nothing quite like game action, so there'll probably still be some rust. But like I would agree, it does sound like those two are probably trending towards being more probable than they have been in recent games.
Yeah, it feels like if there's a game to bring them back for, this is
Yeah,
probably the one with the stakes
probably
on the
yeah,
line.
100%, 100%.
Yeah. Well, that does it for our Monday show. Be sure to join us this Friday at 1 p.m. Central as we break down all the action from this week. Thanks for watching.